Hey everyone, tonight we start with the amazing world of ancient Rome, a society that had the time and confidence to try out every substance on Earth to see what would happen. So, before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always interesting to see who from all over the world is joining us. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan to make it soft. Background noise, and let's slowly get ready for tonight's trip together. When most people think of ancient Rome, they see marble statues, stern senators, and philosophers walking around with a look of deep disappointment on their faces. They don't picture an empire where half the people were walking around the streets, a little drunk, a little happy, or spiritually sure they had just gotten a private message from Jupiter himself. But that's the kind of Rome we're going to talk about tonight. The Rome that your history teacher completely ignored violence, because this is the truth that makes me uncomfortable. The Roman Empire wasn't sober. Rome was an experiment in the ancient world to see what would happen if a superpower acted like a wine festival that lasted for 800 years. In Rome, wine was more than just a drink. It was water, medicine, social glue, emotional support, personality improvement, and maybe even the basis of national policy, according to some of their emperors. And to be honest, most Romans weren't drinking it in tiny glasses. They were drinking wine that tasted like raisins, seawater, and choices they would later regret. This wine was also very strong, not strong enough for dinner, more who needs dinner strong. And Romans, who were very curious, kept adding herbs, spices, flowers, resins, and any leaves that happened to be growing near their feet. Mandre? Of course. Henbane? Why not? If it made your vision swim a little or helped you understand better. The Romans thought it was fair game for the gods. And they didn't just drink wine. Rome did business with everyone: Greece, Egypt, and Persia. In other words, every strange plant, every mind-bending resin, and every herb that seemed suspicious came to Rome like a gift basket from the universe saying, "Please use responsibly," which of course they didn't. It wasn't safe to go to temples either. Priests stood over burning braziers, breathing in the smoke like they were trying out for a rocket launch powered by incense from long ago. People who worship went to a normal religious ceremony and came out thinking they had talked to a statue. Now you know why Roman religion had so many visions, omens, and messages from the gods. The temples were like hot boxes, but with better design. But Romans acted like all of this was perfectly normal. Why wouldn't it be? You make the best army in the ancient world, as well as roads and aqueducts. And then you relax by slightly separating yourself from reality. Balance. Rome was more than just an empire. It was the biggest and longest running thing in the ancient world. Are we sure this is a good idea? Try it out. And, surprisingly, it worked for them. Let me stop you right there if you think the Romans drank wine like we do. Roman wine wasn't a light, fruity drink that you sipped while pretending to enjoy talking to people. In a clay jar, Roman wine was a biochemical experiment. It was strong and powerful, and people often messed with it so much that modern health inspectors would have passed out right there. First, get this. It was not common for Romans to drink wine straight. They thought that drinking pure wine was barbaric and that only uncivilized foreigners or people who had nothing to lose would do it. It was so strong that drinking it straight up was like saying, I want to taste colors today. But adding water didn't make it safer, because the Romans also liked to add flavor enhancers, which is what ancient Romans called plants that should never be mixed with alcohol. They added spices like saffron and cinnamon, which are safe, but they kept going anyway. They put in myrrh, they added pitch, they put in resin, they added herbs that old medical writers called inducing visions, loosening the mind, and opening the gates of sleep. In other words, this is how you accidentally meet Jupiter. There was also the Candidum paradox, the wine that surprised everyone. The hallucinations were the surprise. This drink combined wine with honey, pepper, dates, saffron, and other spices. Sometimes a few plants that no one could say correctly at the time. It was the kind of drink that started out as a harmless topic of conversation and ended with someone yelling that they could hear the walls breathing. But Rome didn't stop there. Rich Romans tried to make the strongest, strangest, or most interesting wines. You didn't serve good food if you wanted to impress your dinner guests. That was up to you. But you definitely served them wine that made them question their lives. Meanwhile, the lower class Romans drank whatever they could afford, from very cheap wine to wine that had been boiled, watered down, fermented twice, flavored with seawater, or left outside for so long that it became a whole new organism. What happened? Everyone, from the rich to the poor, from the senator to the slave, from the philosopher to the farmer, was always a little bit drunk. Plato would have fainted. Linenets would have gone home from the party. The average Roman shrugged and asked for another cup. To Romans, wine wasn't just a part of life. It was life. It was a way to connect with others, a medicine, a way to have fun, a way to relieve stress, and sometimes a way to get closer to God. Discipline didn't run Rome. Wine that was so strong that it could probably power a small engine ran Rome. If you've ever wondered what a Roman medicine cabinet looked like, picture something like a witch's pantry or a cheap drugstore run by someone who shouldn't have been left alone. The Romans didn't keep simple painkillers on hand. No, they kept plants that could either heal you, knock you out, or make you think you had reached a higher level of existence. Sometimes all three at once. Let's begin with henbane. Modern toxicologists look at this plant and say, please don't. But the Romans said it was great for wine. Henbane made you see things that weren't there, made you dizzy, gave you weird dreams, and if you took too much, it made you forget about reality for a short time. People used it in love potions, sleep aids, and sometimes to make dull dinner parties more fun. What makes social events better than everyone seeing things that aren't there? Then there's Mandre, the most famous ancient psychoactive plant. Alkaloids in mandrake root can make you see things clearly, numb your body, and put you to sleep deeply. It was so strong that writers told people to tie a dog to the root and let it pull it out. They said that the safest thing to do was to put the dog at risk instead of yourself. It was used by the Romans to ease pain, infertility, sadness, and, based on some surviving accounts, boredom. You felt better if you took a little. If you took a little more, you fell asleep. If you took too much, you went to the afterlife for a short time. And then there was opium, the Roman cure-all. Do you have pain? Opium. Having trouble sleeping? Opium. Stressed? Opium. Are your neighbor's geese too loud? Opium probably wouldn't have worked, but the Romans would have tried anyway. Rome was full of opium, in medicine, in rituals, in beauty products, and maybe in. Half of the talks that seemed philosophical were really just two very calm people not getting what the other was saying. But we're not finished. Romans also tried nightshade, belladonna, poppy seeds, hemp, and other strange plants that merchants brought from the East with a sales pitch like, "This will change your life." It usually did, but not always in the way people wanted. The best part was that the Romans took these herbs without a doubt. No fear, no doubt, no. Talk to a doctor before using. They thought, if nature grew it, we're drinking it. Their cabinet of herbs wasn't for medicine, it was a wheel of fortune. The Romans also turned that wheel every day. If there were an award for most likely to accidentally send you to another dimension in ancient Rome, Mandre would win it every year. This plant wasn't just strong. People knew about it. A scary, magical, and somewhat dramatic reputation that Romans somehow saw as good. Let's boil it down and drink it. Mandre root looks a little like a human body, but this didn't scare the Romans. It was an ad. They thought that anything that looked like a person must be good for people. This is the kind of thinking you get after drinking wine mixed with seawater. Mandre was used for pain relief, anesthesia, sleep, love potions, and any time Romans wanted to leave the physical world for a while and see what Jupiter was up to that day. But the process of harvesting was different. Old. Writers said that Mandre screamed when they pulled him out of the ground, a scream so deadly that anyone who heard it would die, pass out, or have a very bad day. Modern science has made it clear that this is not true. But the Romans of old didn't get the message. They were serious about following safety rules. What did they do? Put a leash on the route. Tell the dog to pull it out. Get away as fast as you can. Come back later to get your prize. This was seen as medically responsible once the Mandre was safe. Romans took care of the dog in a number of cute ways after giving it emotional support. They boiled it down to make potions. They added wine to it. They made salves out of it. They breathed it in like incense. No Roman ever said, maybe this is too much. In fact, the main question was, how much can we get away with before we start seeing gods? And oh, did they see gods? Mandre didn't just relax you, it took you away. Light doses made you sleepy, while medium doses made you sleepy. Large doses gently put you into a temporary coma, which is like saying, I'm going to disappear for a bit. Please don't touch my sandals. Roman doctors used mandre as anesthesia during surgeries. Yes, anesthesia. While the patient drifted blissfully in and out of consciousness, surgeons got to work with bronze tools and a level of confidence we should all find deeply concerning. Mandre was powerful, mystical, unpredictable, and absolutely beloved. It changed moods, altered perceptions, and opened the door to experiences Romans swore were spiritual and modern people would call, "You've taken too much." In short, Mandre was the Roman rocket ship, and many Romans were absolutely willing to board. If you've ever wondered how ancient Roman priests managed to speak with the gods, here's a secret your textbooks politely left out. Many temples were essentially beautifully decorated. Smoke chambers filled with mandaltering fumes, strong, enough to make a stone statue rethink its life choices. The priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were the best hotbox survivors in the ancient world. Let's start with the temples. Some were built over natural vents, where gases seeped from underground. To a Roman, this meant divine presence. To a modern geologist, it means do not inhale that. But inhale it they did joyfully, reverently, and often while chanting hymns that probably sounded extra intense when the walls started to. Priests stood right above these vents, their robes blowing in warm vapors that contained methane, ethylene, and other gases that give the human brain the gentle nudge needed to start seeing things that are absolutely not there. And because an ancient people interpreted everything as divine symbolism, nobody stopped to ask whether the gods were speaking or the fumes were. But even temples without natural gases weren't safe. Romans burned incense mixes that would terrify a modern health professional. These blends didn't just smell good like frankincense. They often had herbs that made you see better, which is a very polite way of saying, "Congratulations, you're about to meet the gods, whether you like it or not." Take henbane, for example. Putting it in a brazier didn't just make the room smell interesting, it made it come to life. Worshippers said they saw floating lights, gods appearing in smoke, and heard messages on the wind. Meanwhile, the priest, who was breathing in twice as much, they probably had to hold on to the altar to avoid meeting Jupiter in person. Then there was the famous Oracle of Delhi, which the Romans later took over. Pilgrims traveled across continents to hear a priestess mutter cryptic prophecies while sitting above a volcanic vent that released sweet-smelling psychoactive gases. People thought she was inspired by God. She was inspired, but not by anything on Olympus. The Romans didn't think any of this was strange. It was just a normal Saturday, a tradition. You have to admire them. They built marble temples, set the stage with incense, added a lot of mind-altering vapor, and called it religion. And to be fair, it worked. People left feeling enlightened, changed, and sometimes confused about whether their vision was spiritual or just the fumes doing their job. In ancient Rome, spirituality wasn't just believed, it was inhaled. If you think modern parties get out of hand, let me gently take you to ancient Rome's Dionysian and Bacchic festivals, where not only was sobriety uncommon, it was actively discouraged. These weren't parties, they were full-body spiritual raves fueled by wine, music, chanting, dubious herbs, and an atmosphere that said, the gods can judge us later. The Romans got these rituals from the Greeks, who worshipped Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and doing things you can't explain to your neighbors. The next morning, Rome renamed him Bacchus and said, perfect, let's throw the parties. Louder. These festivals were meant to break down barriers, erase social status, and free people from the heavy burden of Roman society, which included taxes, war, political betrayal, and togas held together by hope. After months of living a disciplined Roman life, people didn't just want a break, they wanted divine chaos. And the ingredients were plentiful. Wine flowed like a river with boundary issues. Not just casual sipping wine. We're talking about the kind of wine that had been boiled, spiced, and enhanced with herbs chosen specifically for their mind-opening properties. Priests blessed it. Musicians encouraged it. Philosophers probably pretended they were above it until the third cup. But wine wasn't the only thing in play. Some rituals included psychoactive leaves, inhaled fumes, and incense mixtures whose recipes remain suspiciously vague in surviving texts. Scholars love to say things like, participants entered altered states, which is the academic way of admitting that ancient Romans were vibing with the universe. There were drums, flutes, chanting, ecstatic dancing, and whole crowds moving in rhythmic waves under torchlight. At the peak of the night, participants said they could feel bakers entering their bodies, guiding their movements, loosening their minds, and sometimes even convincing them they were vines gently swaying in the wind. Meanwhile, a sober observer, if such a creature existed, probably looked on and thought, this is why Rome needs curfews. These festivals blurred the line between religion and people went to these events to feel free, connected, and spiritually free, and to get the kind of emotional release that comes from singing loudly while not quite knowing where the ground is. The Roman Senate eventually tried to ban or regulate these rituals because they were too wild, which is an impressive statement coming from a government that casually hosted public executions as entertainment. But bans couldn't battle Bacchus. People wanted transcendence, liberation, and a night off from reality, and back. Rome had legions, laws, and discipline, but it also had parties that were so wild they made the gods blush. If you thought Rome's public festivals were crazy, wait until you hear about the private ones. There were secret societies, nighttime ceremonies, and ritual potions with ingredients that historians politely call pharmacologically interesting. Welcome to the mystery cults, Rome's 520p lounges of spiritual transformation, where the dress code was robes and the guest list had to be kept secret, and sometimes a tolerance for altered states of consciousness. Mystery cults weren't fringe groups. They were incredibly popular among Romans who wanted a deeper, more emotional connection with the divine, something beyond the typical Roman sacrifice and go-home routine. People sought meaning, comfort, transcendence, and apparently hallucinogenic beverages. The most famous of these groups was tied to the Eleusinian Mysteries, originally Greek, but extremely fashionable among upper-class Romans. The centerpiece of the ritual was the kaikon, a sacred drink whose recipe was vague, suspiciously vague. Ancient writers described it as barley based, which sounds harmless until modern scholars pointed out something intriguing. Barley is a perfect host for ergot, a fungus containing the chemical precursor to LSD. Yes, the potion might have been accidentally on purpose psychedelic. Pilgrims drank it after days of fasting, chanting, and sensory overload. The combination was basically a spiritual catapult. Participants spent the night in a dark temple undergoing visions described as life changing, soul purifying, and beyond human explanation, which is ancient Greek for I'm having a moment. Rome also hosted the Orphic Mysteries, which offered salvation, reincarnation, purification, and depending on the recipe, a mild to moderate dissociation from the physical world. Their rituals involved torches, music, ecstatic movement, and secret hymns that made people feel like they were drifting between realms. And then there were the Isis mysteries, imported from Egypt. These ceremonies had incense that was so thick it looked like fog, rhythmic chanting, and music that shook the floor. People who took part said they saw the goddess Isis in visions. Modern historians gently suggest that they might have been meeting a mix of incense fumes, exhaustion, and whatever herbs got into the ritual wine. All mystery cults had one thing in common: experience. They weren't just polite visits to the temple, they were immersive journeys. The goal was to break down normal consciousness and rebuild it with divine meaning. Altered states weren't side effects, they were features. The best part was that members had to keep their secrets. So, our sources range from life changing revelations to I legally cannot tell you what happened, which is the historical equivalent of someone saying, last night was crazy, but I signed an NDA. Mystery cults weren't just spiritual movements, they were Rome's hidden gateways to transcendence, emotional, and sometimes chemical. If ancient Rome had a one-size-fits-all solution to life's problems, it wasn't philosophy, discipline, or stoicism. It was opium, the Roman equivalent of a sleep button, a painkiller, a mood stabilizer, and a temporary vacation from reality, all rolled into one tiny poppy-derived miracle. Opium wasn't rare. It wasn't exotic. It wasn't hidden behind temple doors or guarded by priests with torches. It was normal, almost. It was disturbingly normal. Romans kept it in their homes like modern people keep cough syrup or bandages. If you walked into a Roman home and didn't see some kind of poppy extract lying around, you would probably think you were in the wrong house. Doctors, and I use that term loosely, prescribed opium for almost everything: headaches, toothaches, fevers, broken bones, grief, sadness, insomnia, boredom, and the emotional burden of living in an empire where someone might stab you in the forum for looking too confident. If you had a problem, opium had an opinion about it, and Roman doctors didn't hold back. They mixed opium with wine, honey, spices, and sometimes herbs that would make a modern pharmacist faint. They gave it to you as a drink, a pill, a salve, or if you were unlucky, a suppository. They didn't care how it got into your system as long as it got into your system. But opium wasn't just for the sick. Soldiers used it to get through long marches and painful wounds. Mothers used it to sleep after putting their children to bed. Philosophers used it to think deeply, which is ancient Roman for stare at a wall and hope the universe reveals its secrets. Even poets used it to inspire creativity, which explains a lot about Roman poetry. The effects, oh, they were glorious, at least from the Roman point of view. Light doses relaxed the body and softened pain. Medium doses brought warmth, euphoria, and the sudden belief that you were wiser than everyone in the room. High doses tucked you into a dream heavy. You could sleep so deeply that you could miss several major political assassinations and wake up feeling better. But as always, Rome went too far. Some wealthy Romans liked stronger preparations, which is ancient historian language. For please stop doing that. Your soul is trying to leave your body. Opium dependency existed long before modern medicine recognized the word. Still, Romans never blamed the opium. They blamed fate or the gods or the stressful nature of empire building. Opium wasn't just a medicine, it was Rome's emotional crutch, spiritual pacifier, and universal reset button. When life got too loud, Romans pressed the poppy. If Mondre was the Roman rocket ship and opium was the Roman sleep button, then henbane was the Roman. Why did we ever think this was a good idea? Henbane was one of those plants that absolutely everyone should have left alone, which of course meant the Romans embraced it with enthusiasm and optimism bordering on delusion. Henbane looked innocent enough, a leafy green plant with pale flowers and a mildly. It had a sinister vibe, but every part of its seeds, leaves, stems, and roots contained alkaloids that could change how you see reality, like a bored god. Modern toxicologists warn against touching it. Romans looked at it and said, let's mix it with wine. Why? Because it made people feel relaxed, euphoric, dreamy, and sometimes convinced that they were floating 3 feet above the ground. Henbane didn't create gentle visions. It created hallucinogenic chaos. Someone might spend half an hour having a polite conversation with a clay statue. Romans used henbane in 3 main ways as a sedative. Doctors gave it to people who were anxious, sleepless, or frankly too loud. A cup of henbane wine would quiet anyone, sometimes a little too well, requiring relatives to nudge the sleeper periodically to confirm they were still among the living as a recreational enhancer. Some Romans enjoyed small doses before parties, claiming it helped them relax. Relax in this case, meaning stare at A, whisper secrets to it. As a medicinal ingredient in eye drops, yes, eye drops. Rome truly did not fear consequences. What made henbane especially dangerous was its inconsistency. 2 leaves might make you pleasantly drowsy. 3 could send you into a philosophical debate with a passing cloud. 4 might briefly transport you to the afterlife for a quick tour. Roman medical texts included helpful warnings like do not exceed the appropriate dose without specifying what the appropriate dose actually was. And still, Romans kept using it. Even Roman soldiers carried henbane mixtures, not to be brave, but to ease their pain. Nothing says centurion morale like a legion marching across Gaul with half the troops quietly hallucinating friendlier landscapes. Henbane didn't discriminate either. Rich, poor, free, enslaved, anyone could take too much and suddenly find themselves spiritually communing with a candle. But Rome never blamed the plant. Rome blamed human error, fate, or bad luck. Henbane is safe, they'd say, as long as. You're careful, which is the Roman way of saying we haven't learned anything. Henbane wasn't a tool, it was a dare, and Romans took it every time. If you ever thought that ancient Roman parties were probably classy and refined, I'm sorry to tell you that you were very wrong. Yes, there were marble dining couches, golden cups, musicians, and servants carrying trays of delicacies. But beneath all that elegance was something much less refined. Rooms filled with psychoactive substances on purpose. The vapors made guests feel relaxed, euphoric, blissful, or slightly disconnected from the passage of time. Rich Romans didn't just have dinners, they planned events, heating scented oils over bronze burners until the room was filled with perfumed clouds thick enough to be called weather was a sure sign of an elite gathering. Some of these oils contained rose, cinnamon, myrrh, or cardamom, which are all lovely, harmless, and respectable ingredients. Others contained plants that ancient writers described in charming ways, like induces forgetfulness, loosens the limbs, or promotes visions, which is historian language for please ventilate your home. Guests reclined on cushioned couches as attendants warmed braziers, poured aromatic oils over glowing coals, and let sweet smoke drift lazily across the room. The wealthy called this elite relaxation. A modern fire safety inspector would call it a series of poor decisions. Some hosts preferred key, an Egyptian incense blend containing raisins, honey, wine, herbs, and depending on the recipe, ingredients, with mild narcotic effects. Others brought in exotic resins from Arabia that made you feel like you were floating when you breathed them in. There were even stories of Romans mixing hallucinogenic herbs into their burners, making a fragrant haze that made guests feel philosophical, emotional, and very interested in the ceiling. And then there were the steam rooms, because of course Rome had steam rooms. Wealthy bathhouse vaporized oils and herbs for health benefits. But let's be honest, if you sit in a sealed, if you stay in a stone chamber filled with steaming, psychoactive plants for long enough, you'll not only feel better, you'll also be transported. These fumigated rooms weren't accidents. Hosts carefully planned them to have just the right amount of scent, warmth, and mystery to get people talking. If a guest seemed a little lost, that was a compliment. If someone lost track of what century it was, that was even better. That meant the party was a success. Imagine lying next to flickering lamps, the air heavy with scented smoke, wine in hand, surrounded by half-drunk philosophers arguing about the stars, while everyone slowly drifts into an incense-fueled dream state. That wasn't an unusual Roman evening. That was Tuesday. Fumigation wasn't decoration, it was entertainment. Invisible, fragrant, and sometimes strong enough to make guests question whether the floor was moving. If you ever feel concerned about modern medicine, just remember at least your doctor isn't a Roman. Lamps, the air heavy with scented smoke, wine in hand, surrounded by half drunk philosophers arguing about the stars, while everyone slowly drifts into an incense fueled dream state. That wasn't an unusual Roman evening. That was Tuesday. Fumigation wasn't decoration, it was entertainment, invisible, fragrant, and occasionally strong enough to make guests questions whether the floor was moving. If you ever feel concerned about modern medicine, just remember at least your doctor isn't a Roman. For centuries, ancient Roman doctors used a strange mix of creativity, confidence, and catastrophic guesswork that somehow passed for science. When it came to mind altering drugs, Roman doctors didn't just prescribe them, they celebrated them. Their medical motto might as well have been, if it grows and doesn't kill you right away, it's medicinal. Let's start with the basics. Romans thought that almost every illness, whether physical, emotional, or existential, could be cured by a drug. Be solved by combining wine with whatever plant happened to be nearby. Fever, wine with poppy extract. Insomnia, wine with mandre. Toothache, wine with henbane. Stress from political chaos, food shortages, or unpredictable emperors, wine with more wine. Roman medical texts casually describe these mixtures as soothing, relaxing, or helpful for clearing the mind, which is suspiciously poetic language for substances that had people temporarily forgetting their own names. And Roman doctors gave these treatments with the calmness of someone who had never once questioned their life choices. Take sleep medicine, for example. Modern sleep aids come with dosage instructions, side effects, and long warnings. Roman sleep aids came in clay cups labeled, "Trust me, I'm a physician." A typical Roman sedative could include opium, mandre, saffron, and a nice splash of strong wine. Patients didn't so much fall asleep as depart in painkillers. Those were even more dramatic. Roman surgeons used mandre and opium to knock out patients. Before procedures, it worked sort of. The patient would be unconscious, but also potentially having vivid visions of the underworld, while surgeons casually operated with bronze tools and reassuring comments like, "Try to lie still." But Roman doctors didn't stop at ingestion. They made topical treatments too. Balms, salves, ointments rubbed directly onto the skin. These mixtures often contained psychoactive herbs that seeped into the bloodstream and made patients both physically numb and spiritually confused. Imagine going in for muscle pain and coming home convinced you had briefly floated above your own body. And for emotional distress, Romans prescribed perfumes infused with narcotics, incense burners with calming vapors, or long baths steeped in herbs that would make a modern herbalist scream into a pillow. The best part, everyone acted like this was perfectly normal. The doctor, the patient, the neighbors, all nodding in approval as though hallucinating mildly during treatment was simply part of the healing process. In Rome, medicine wasn't just about curing illness, it was about temporarily relocating your consciousness while the illness figured out what to do next. If ancient Rome had a most unpredictable substance award, mushrooms would accept it proudly, or possibly refuse it because it was hallucinating the podium. Mushrooms were the great wild cards of the Roman world, sometimes delicious, sometimes deadly, sometimes spiritually enlightening, and sometimes capable of sending an emperor straight to the afterlife. In other words, the perfect ingredient for Roman curiosity. Romans loved mushrooms. They cultivated them, collected them, cooked them, traded them, and boasted about them at dinner parties. But here's the problem. Ancient Rome did not have mushroom identification guides. They did not have trained mycologists. They had enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is a dangerous replacement for expertise. Some mushrooms were harmless and tasty. Others were so toxic that a single bite could turn a feast into a funeral. The infamous Amanita Floyds, better known as the Death Cap, grew happily across the empire and had an unfortunate resemblance to several edible varieties. This caused events, but Romans being Romans, they didn't stop to reconsider. Instead, they expanded their mushroom adventures. They experimented. They tasted. They infused mushrooms into stews, sauces, and wines. And some Romans went further. They sought out mushrooms believed to have mind-altering effects, ones that induced visions, dreams, spiritual clarity, or in some cases, miscommunications with furniture. Wealthy elites, always eager to outdo each other, served rare mushroom dishes at banquets. The rarer the mushroom, the more impressed the guests. But rare didn't always mean safe. In fact, one emperor, Claudius, famously died after eating mushrooms his wife prepared. Ancient gossip pretty much says, yes, she absolutely poisoned him. But either way, mushrooms played a starring role in imperial drama. Some Romans believed. Some people thought that certain mushrooms could bring them closer to the gods, and that their effects were not poisonous, but divine. When dried, boiled, or mixed with wine, these mushrooms created experiences that were described as dreamlike, vision-inducing, or a conversation with destiny, depending on how poetic the writer was feeling. Did all of these mushrooms have actual psychedelic properties? Not all of them, but some probably did. Rome had access to regions in the Alps, Balkans, and Near East where psychoactive species grew. Travelers brought stories of dreamlike experiences back to Rome. Mushrooms, night mushrooms, and laughing mushrooms made people feel so happy that they couldn't stop. Of course, Romans wanted to try them. What better way to make a festival, a dinner, or a philosophical debate more interesting? But mushrooms had a bad reputation for being dangerous. They were like culinary Russian roulette. In ancient Rome, a delightful surprise or an immediate tragedy. But this didn't stop Romans. It made them want to try them even more. Nothing appealed more to Roman sensibilities than a food that combined luxury, risk, and the chance to see the divine. Divine. Mushrooms weren't just food. They were mystery. They were thrill. They were temptation. In Rome, even dinner could alter reality. When you picture gladiators stepping into the arena, You probably imagine discipline, grit, and raw physical power. What you don't imagine is a handful of them entering the Colosseum slightly buzzed, mildly sedated, or spiritually convinced the lions were large house cats. But welcome to Rome, where even the most brutal profession occasionally intersected with the empire's favorite, recreational drugs. Gladiators were elite athletes, but they were also property, expensive property. Their owners wanted them alive, profitable, and entertaining. So before fights, some gladiators received herbal mixtures designed to enhance performance. Others received sedatives designed to ease anxiety, and occasionally, a poor soul received something that made the arena look like a dreamscape painted by a confused god. One common preparation, poppy-based tonics. These weren't full opium doses. The Leinster trainer owner wasn't trying to knock them out, but light mixtures meant to calm nerves, dull pain, and keep the gladiator from freaking out when he saw a very hungry, very athletic lion. The goal was simple: get them into the arena feeling confident and focused, not scared of death. Of course, since Rome was Rome, the results varied. A lightly dosed gladiator might feel brave, steady, and ready for fame. A moderately dosed gladiator might feel extremely philosophical and try to talk to his opponent. And a heavily dosed gladiator might walk into the arena with the calm of someone who thinks their fate has already been decided, because in their mind, it probably had. But not all substances were calming. Some trainers tried out stimulating herbs that were supposed to make them more aggressive. These mixtures often had bitter extracts, strong spices, or questionable leaves that traders from other countries brought in and exaggerated their benefits. A gladiator might enter the arena pumped with adrenaline, energy, and absolutely. There were also rare reports of hallucinogenic herbs getting into pre-fight mixes. No trainer would ever admit this, but a few ancient writers talked about fighters who swung at shadows, bowed to invisible gods, or charged confidently toward lions they thought were symbols instead of teeth-equipped realities. But in fairness, the arena was scary. If a small herbal boost of courage helped someone face down a rhinoceros imported, who can blame them for wanting to have fun? The crowd never knew, of course. They thought gladiators were fueled by bravery, discipline, and raw Roman spirit. But backstage, someone might have been saying, "Drink this, don't ask what's in it." Good luck. The arena wasn't just blood and sand. Sometimes it was wine, herbs, and just a hint of altered perception. If ordinary Romans experimented with herbs and intoxicating fumes, then the emperors with unlimited wealth, unlimited ego, and there was no adult supervision at all, which took things to a whole new level. Being emperor meant you could have the best wines, the rarest plants, and a palace staff whose full-time job was to nod politely when you asked for a drink that would make a philosopher cry. Let's start with Caligula, a man who lived his life like a dare. Caligula reportedly liked strong wine mixtures with exotic spices, some that made him feel good and some that made him feel bad. Pharmacologically concerning, these concoctions fueled his late-night parties, bizarre decisions, and his general approach to governance, which resembled a fever dream more than a political strategy. Then there was Nero, a man famous for performing poetry, starting fires allegedly, and believing he was the greatest artist the world had ever seen. A belief surely strengthened by the mind altering incense burned in his extravagant dining halls. Nero's parties involved perfumed vapors released from hidden ceiling panels, rare foreign wines infused with herbs, and musicians who played for hours while guests slowly drifted into pleasantly numbed states. If you left the party still aware of what century it was, Nero considered it a failure. But no emperor embraced chemical curiosity like Hadrian, who traveled the empire collecting strange plants the way that other rulers collected taxes. He consulted healers, magicians, and herbalists from distant provinces, each offering extracts, potions, and brews of insight. Some were mild relaxants. According to surviving notes, some people could cause dreams of remarkable clarity, which is ancient world code for you are about to meet your spirit animal. Even emperors with karma reputations weren't immune. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher emperor, relied heavily on theory, a potent herbal compound containing opium. He took it for pain relief, though it surely didn't hurt that it also helped him tolerate the Roman Senate, which was enough to drive any sober man to spiritual reconsideration. And then we have the imperial doctors. These weren't traditional doctors. They told the emperors to try rare roots, magical herbs, and powders from Arabia, Persia, and India. Every new plant was a chance, a miracle, a danger, or a way to start a conversation. The emperors of Rome lived in a strange mix of stress, power, creativity, paranoia, and sometimes whatever potion their doctor made that morning. When you rule the largest empire on earth, reality can feel heavy, and Roman emperors, being human, sometimes chose to lighten it up with things strong enough to make the gods raise an eyebrow. After wandering through Rome's vineyards, temples, bathhouses, apothecaries, and sometimes questionable kitchens, one thing becomes very clear. The ancient Romans weren't just curious about altered states, they treated them like a national pastime. Rome's legacy isn't just roads, aqueducts, and Latin grammar. It's also a surprisingly long list of substances, rituals, and fumes.